Bonjour, hi. Je suis très heureux d'être ici. Merci à Pierre-Carl, merci à tout le monde d'être ici aussi. C'est vrai que ça fait environ 6 mois que j'habite Montréal et je travaille à HEC pendant mon sabbatique de l'Université de Toronto. J'ai pris le temps d'apprendre un peu le français, mais je ne crois pas que je puisse vous parler en français sur un sujet technique comme ça. Alors, maintenant, je vais parler anglais, mais je vous invite de me poser des questions en français, si vous voulez. Ça marchera, je pense. And I'm going to talk about income taxation and the demand for redistribution with a focus on Quebec and Canada. And by the demand for redistribution, I mean in the process of my research here in Montreal this year, I have been thinking about how much our governments redistribute through the tax system and through other policies, about what that tells us about how much we as Canadians and Quebecois care about redistribution from rich to poor, and what we can learn as economists about what policies are most effective in promoting simultaneously reduction of inequality, redistribution, and simultaneously the enhancement of productivity and efficiency in the economy. And so my hope in 40 minutes is to tell you the answers to those questions. And so in thinking about redistribution, we should recognize that government's policies affect household income in several different ways. First of all, we can think about redistribution from rich to poor through the income tax system and the associated transfers to low-income families. But second, we should think about what economists and political scientists call pre-distribution policies. These are policies such as education programs, training programs of various kinds, job subsidy programs as well, which affect the productivity of workers, affect the levels of employment of workers, all through the income distribution, and therefore their earnings. And so we should recognize that government can redistribute after taxes through the tax system, or they can redistribute pre-tax incomes through policies of this kind. And they're both potentially effective. We want to be able to compare them and decide which policies are better. Finally, I'll say it's not just income taxes. We have to think about the cost of living for families in different places in the income distribution. A variety of taxes and subsidies and even regulatory policies affect the cost of living and cause indirectly redistribution among family types. So for me, for economists, the key questions are how can we evaluate all these different policies relative to a common metric, way of judging their benefits, and therefore determining which policies give us the best value for money if we want to simultaneously increase productivity in the economy while helping the poorest among us. And in thinking about that, of course, it begs the question, should we as people evaluating government or participating in government, should we always be thinking about the equity portion of the impacts of a government policy? Or are there certain times at which really only productivity and efficiency issues matter? So I'll speak a little bit about that as well, when it's appropriate to think about redistribution in judging a government policy. So that's a little bit abstract, perhaps, to begin, but let's think of some examples of the kind of questions I would like to answer. We can imagine a $100 million spending program the government is engaging in, which is intended to raise incomes of people in the lowest 20%, the lowest quintile of the income distribution. Well, if the program costs $100 million and it raises incomes by $80 million for those families, is that an effective program or not? Is that worth spending $100 million on? Another very different kind of program we could evaluate using this framework. I'm thinking, frankly, of the Rogers-Shaw merger, which maybe we should call the Rogers-Shaw Videotron merger here in Montreal. Should a corporate merger be allowed if it reduces the costs of the company through efficiencies by $100 million, but at the same time it raises the costs, the prices that consumers pay, say by $50 million? Is that an effective trade-off? The gains for the shareholders of the company compared to the losses for the consumers of the telecommunications products. How do I know whether that's a good trade-off or not? And then finally, we can think about carbon pricing in this context as well. Is it justified to have a carbon tax if, for example, low-income families will have to pay the costs of that, and they're particularly onerous because low-income families heat their homes using fuel oil? We could also think about the possibility that low-income families heat their home with natural gas. Obviously, that's irrelevant. No one should ever think about natural gas in this context, but heating oil is a harder question. I'm teasing the Trudeau government, which has made a distinction between those two policies. But the broader question of how a carbon tax, which we need for other reasons, affects affordability for different families in the income distribution is an important one we should think about. So today I'm going to present you a framework for thinking about all these questions. What am I going to try to do? It's cost-benefit analysis, a common subject for economists like me, but a cost-benefit analysis that takes inequality seriously. I'm going to place a dollar value on the inequality impacts that government policies have, and I'm going to show you when those impacts matter and would affect whether we should do a policy or not. Okay, what's the key idea then? It's that inequality has a social cost, and we can measure that cost. And how do we measure it? You might think it's just a question of your ethical opinions, that we could all have a different opinion about how much inequality matters. But in fact, that's true. We could all have a different opinion. But we all share in the costs and benefits of a government which is making certain choices about how to redistribute and to address inequality. And that's our income tax system and our transfer system. The income tax system does reduce inequality, but at the same time, it creates efficiency costs in the economy. For example, through the work disincentives, if there are higher tax rates, we believe and we know from our evidence that people work less as a result, and that results in an efficiency loss associated with the tax system's reduction in inequality. And so the benefit of reducing inequality through any other means other than the income tax system can be measured. The benefit of reducing inequality, say through a spending program that benefits low-income families, is the cost that we avoid by not using the income tax system to have the same impact on those families. Since we can measure the cost of efficiency losses through the income tax system, and I'll show you how, we now know what value to place on any other program that helps low-income families relative to high-income families. So the avoided cost notion will be central to what I'll talk about. I will present estimates of that cost of redistribution through the income tax system at each income level, at each percentage or percentile of the income distribution in Canada. And that's a cost measure, but it also tells you something about how much we care as Canadians about redistribution, right? It tells you, given the choices that we're making and my estimates of what economic costs that creates, we learn how much Canadians actually care about redistributing, for example, away from the top 1%, or redistributing, for example, towards people in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. So we learn something about ourselves from this technique. I'll show you those numbers, and then I'll talk about certain applications. I'll talk about what I just did, how much we care in comparing different governments over time in Canada. I'll talk about carbon pricing in some more detail, this question of what is affordable, how that should affect our choices. And then I'll talk about the work that I have been doing this year in Montreal, in part here in Montreal, about the standard of living, the niveau de vie, l'écart de, back to English, shall we? the level, the standard of living and the gap between Ontario and Quebec as a policy objective of the Legault government. So I'll offer some observations as I see it on that question. Bon. just a few words, a little bit academic, about how I got to think about these questions. There is a long history of studying these questions in economics. We call it cost-benefit analysis. Here's a short history of that study. Economists want to know what is a good policy or a bad one, and they want to know how to trade off, how to make the choice between these two issues I've talked about. A policy that's efficient, that causes the economy to grow, versus a policy that helps the poorest among us. So equity versus efficiency is important. A long time ago, before World War II, two great British economists, Hicks and Kaldor, proposed a way to think about this. What they said is almost any policy that the government could do will create benefits for some and costs for others. It will create winners and losers. But we can say that that reform, that policy is good if it causes big enough gains for the winners that they could compensate the losers. They might not actually do it, but if they could, we will say that passes the compensation test and it's a desirable reform to do. So that's the Hicks-Kaldor principle. More recent research by other economists has recognized it's not that simple. If we're not really paying the compensation to the losers, we should recognize that it would be costly to pay that compensation. We would have to change our income tax system to do that. We'll create the costs I've talked about, and that we should include those costs of compensation in evaluating these changes. And so I'm adopting that framework that these other economists have. My research tries to clarify that debate, understand when those benefits exist, and then provide these estimates for Canada. And in talking today, I'm going to be drawing on my work with some great Canadian economists, in particular Robin Bodway, known to many of you, and I have worked on the theory of these issues. Together with Pierre Carl, I'm currently working on understanding what the cost of redistribution through the income tax system is, and together with Kevin Milligan of British Columbia and my student Sobia Hassan, we're working on estimating these values for Canada and applying them to analyze the gaps in income between Quebec and Ontario. Okay, so I've already explained the kind of basic idea. We want to measure the cost of redistribution through the income tax system. Let me give you a specific example of how we can do that before I just give you the numbers. So think about this trade-off the government is making when they choose the tax rates on people at each point in the income distribution. And for clarity, let's focus on the choice of the top bracket income tax rate that we might have. Today, we have a tax rate around 50% in the top bracket in Canada. It basically applies to the top 1% of incomes, 1% of families by income. And so we could change that rate. We could increase that rate at the top from 50% to 55%, for example. Now, what would be the impact of that? Well, right now, Canadians who are in that bracket, they report about $100 billion of income that's subject to tax at that 50% rate. They have more income than that, but that's the amount that's in the top bracket. Yeah? So if we were to increase the rate by 5 points, they would pay about $5 billion more in costs, right? It's just math. They would pay about $5 billion or 5% of that in additional costs. But the government would not get $5 billion more in revenue because the higher tax rate would cause more tax avoidance. It could be people choosing to work less, but in the top 1%, I don't think people work less as a result. I think they find better ways to avoid paying taxes, right? But those ways are costly. You have to get a better accountant. You have to rearrange your affairs in a way which is more tax efficient, but less desirable for you personally. And so it creates a cost for those taxpayers to avoid and a gap between what it costs the taxpayers to raise rates versus what the government receives in revenue. And our best estimate is that if we made this hypothetical reform, the government's revenues would not rise by $5 billion. Government's revenues would rise by only $2 billion, okay? And so now think about that choice, right? The government could raise rates by 5 percentage points, create $5 billion in costs for those in the top bracket, gain $2 billion for the rest of us, right? And that tells us, the fact that the government doesn't increase rates tells us that the government appears to value the incomes of people in the top 1% at about 40 cents on the dollar. If they put any lower value than 40 cents, if they put any lower value than 40% of the average value on the incomes of those people, then the government would be advised to increase rates from 50 points to 55 points. If they put any higher value on incomes at the top, the government would be advised to reduce the rate below 50%. So the fact that we're at 50, and given this estimate of the efficiency costs, the avoidance costs of the tax system, I conclude that the government values incomes at the top at 40 cents on the dollar. The social value of $1 to those people, for us as Canadians, is 40 cents. And of course, at the bottom of the distribution, I will arrive at a different number, but that's the logic, and I'll apply it across the overall income distribution. Okay, so to do that, I need to know two things. What the marginal tax rates are, that is the amount of redistribution through the tax system measured by the marginal tax rate. That's the tax that each of us pays on the last dollar that we earn. And I have to know what the distribution of income is. How many people are at each point in the income spectrum. And so here are the marginal tax rates for Canada in 2018, which I will use in doing my calculations. Of course, it depends on what type of family you're in. We have benefits which are targeted at families with children, and so we're making those distinctions. But you can see that tax rates do approach around 50% on average in the top 1%. The x-axis here is the percentile of the income distribution. So when I say P99.5, 99.5% of people have lower incomes than that, 0.5% have higher, and so on. So the rates reach 50% at the top, but they're not much lower than that for many people with lower incomes in Canada. Indeed, for families with children in the middle of the distribution, P50 being the median, you see that marginal tax rates are even higher. They're almost 60% in Canada. And so how could that be? Why are marginal tax rates so high in the middle of the distribution, and what does that tell us? So I will focus on the families with children who face those high rates, and then I will focus on Quebec, just to give one specific example of this. So this is just the same picture, but now for those families in Quebec in 2018. So we can decompose that marginal tax rate, that tax paid on the last dollar earned for all those families, into three different components that are important here. The first is the cash welfare payments. Of course, you do pay tax in Canada on a social assistance, income assistance payment, but that's a very small amount for most people. But as your income rises, the amount of income assistance you're eligible for gets smaller. And that's exactly like a tax. That reduction in your benefit as your income goes up is like a tax. And so the blue component here represents the disincentive effects of reducing income assistance as incomes rise, as people work more. But even in the middle of the income distribution, where very few families receive any of those cash welfare payments, they still receive means-tested benefits from the government, and the most important of which is the Canada Child Benefit of the federal government, but the provincial government has programs as well. And you can see that as incomes rise from around the 30th percentile in Canada, those benefits are also reduced as a function of income. And the result of that is to increase work disincentives, increase marginal tax rates even in the middle of the distribution. So, and then the remaining part, the red portion, is just the taxes that we pay through the regular income tax system. To put all this together, we have relatively high marginal tax rates on most families in Canada, but those high marginal tax rates in the middle of the distribution are telling you that we are redistributing to those families, but we're targeting it on those with the lowest incomes. And so high marginal tax rates mean different things at different points in the distribution, but they're all a sign of redistribution from rich to poor. So taking those estimates of the redistributive effect of the tax system and the transfer system, some complicated calculations, which I will not talk about today, we arrive at these estimates of the value, the social value, the apparent value to us Canadians, of $1 of net income, after-tax income, received by families at each portion of the income distribution. And here are my estimates. In the interest of time, I won't talk about different family types. I'll simply look at the averages in the final column called all taxpayers. You can see that P99, that is the top 1% of the distribution, I estimate that our government acts as though they only put a value of 34%. Before in my example, I said 40. This is very similar, a little more complicated. I arrive at 34% as the value placed on a dollar of income received by someone at the top of the distribution relative to the average in society. As you go down the income distribution, that value rises, of course. We, as a society, place a higher value on incomes received by people with lower incomes. And at the bottom of the distribution, the bottom 10%, we are behaving as though we place a value of $1.41 on each dollar of income received at the bottom. We're acting, in our system, we're acting as though we would be willing as a society to pay $141 to see those people receive $100 in income. Okay, that's our tax system, and I'm suggesting our other policies should be evaluated on the same basis. So just 3 quick applications. How has that changed over time? And how do different governments and different parties reflect their preferences in their choices of a tax system? So this is the same picture of marginal tax rates representing distribution every 10 years back to 1988. What did we learn from this? We learned that tax rates for most Canadians are substantially lower than they were even as recently as 2008, 1998, to make this argument a little clearer. And that reduction in taxes has resulted in a reduction in redistribution from rich to poor in Canada. Now, the top 1%, since the Trudeau government came to power in 2015, the top 1% taxes have risen back up. But with the end of the fiscal retrenchment of the 1990s, there was a widespread reduction in tax rates on most Canadians above the median income. The result of that is less redistribution than we used to have in our system. And so based on those changes over time, I can judge how our implicit attitudes to redistribution have changed. The basic story is we're putting a higher social weight on the upper middle class than we used to. Upper middle class being people between the 75th percentile and the 99th percentile. We used to behave as though we placed a value of 60% on those people. Now we're placing a value more like 80% on those people. So we're redistributing more to the upper middle class than we really ever have in my lifetime in Canada today. The top 1%, it's different. Not just the federal changes of 2016, raising the top federal rate, but changes beginning in Quebec in 2013, Ontario 2014, Alberta even in 2016, raising top bracket tax rates. We've now changed our attitude to the top 1%. That being said, we redistribute less, and that implies we care less about redistribution away from people who are rich but outside the top 1%. Second application, let's see how I'm doing. I'm not doing that well, really.
You're doing good. I don't know what you have to say next.
Right, well, you should judge it and then decide whether I get more time or not. All right, here's what I'm going to say about carbon pricing, if I'm allowed. There's been renewed discussion on April 1st, the carbon tax, the federal carbon price, the backstop, doesn't apply in Quebec, but you're all aware of it. The federal carbon price went up on April 1st. We were already discussing these issues before April 1st, but now it comes more into focus. And to me, the attacks on the federal carbon pricing policy really are about affordability of high prices of fuels for most Canadians. That's what we're debating right now. And I will quote, the leader of the opposition was quoted recently as saying, the problem with carbon pricing is, quote, people across our country are struggling. The last thing they need is another tax increase. So I think he's talking about affordability, right? So it's true. It is more expensive as a result of these policies for ordinary families to do ordinary things. The question is, does that matter? Does that change what we want our policy to be? And I want to be clear that, in my opinion, the opinion I think of most economists, affordability concerns are real, but they do not change what the carbon price should be. And we can fit that into the framework I've been talking about. And it's really very simple. We can have a higher carbon price because we need a higher carbon price, and we can offset the affordability impacts through the income tax system, right? So we have a higher carbon price, we can calculate how much that costs families at each point in the income distribution, and we can reduce their income taxes to offset that change almost completely, almost perfectly. And in doing that, we will not change the efficiency cost of our tax system. We're just increasing it here, decreasing it there, right? Increasing it on the carbon pricing side, decreasing it on the income tax side. Everything is the same at the end of the day for my calculations. And so what do we conclude? We conclude that losers from the higher prices can be compensated through the income tax system at no social cost. And therefore, we'll apply the standard compensation principle to conclude, because of the broader benefits of a higher carbon price, we should just do that. And to be clear, the federal government does not adjust income taxes to compensate for the costs of it. The federal, again, doesn't apply in Quebec, but the federal climate action incentive payments don't fully compensate for the impacts. They tend to be too redistributive. The federal government gives more to low-income families than the principle I just applied would suggest. That's not a problem. They make their redistributive choices. All I'm saying is, because we could compensate, then we should no longer judge that policy as a bad policy just because it has affordability concerns. Okay, there's a little subtlety to that, but the bottom line, of course, is if you're worried about incomes of people, their real incomes after paying the higher price of fuel, if you're worried about real incomes, you've got the income tax system for that. Carbon price serves a different role. That's all I'm saying. Here's my last application, closing the gap. So the Legault government has announced, I find this fascinating as an Ontarian interested in Quebec. The Legault government has announced as an explicit government goal of government policy, closing the gap in per capita GDP between Quebec and Ontario. And I think that that's a useful objective to set in principle. As a symbolic measure, I think it's a very sensible thing to do. It causes renewed focus on productivity, right? And that's something that we should do. Raising GDP per capita is an important objective of government, in my opinion. But the focus on productivity should not obscure the fact that the distribution of income among rich and poor in society is extremely important as well. And we should not simply, obviously, we should not simply look at per capita GDP in making these assessments. Based on ongoing work, it's not finished yet, with Kevin Milligan and Sobia Jaffrey, I'll tell you a little bit about the distribution of, you probably have some awareness of l'écart, the difference according to the standard objective of the Legault government. I'm going to tell you about the gap in real household income before taxes at each point in the income distribution. And in doing this, and I'll go back to 1998 and show you how it's changed. In doing this, I will adjust for differences in the cost of living between Quebec and Ontario. Again, as a Torontonian, spending time in Montreal, it's absolutely clear how important that difference is. I'm going to do that based on Statistics Canada data on the intercity price differences in the country, supplemented, because I'm so concerned about distribution. I want to know not just one number, but a correct number for low-income versus high-income families. So we've estimated the cost of housing for each region in Canada. So for the cost of purchasing the same house, that gives us a regional housing price index, and I'll adjust for those differences as well between Quebec and Ontario. And then I'll tell you a little bit about why we think there is a gap and why that gap is closing. But first, what's happening to the gap at each income level? So this is, again, a similar picture. We'll look over time, 10 years at a time, 98, 08, and 2018. And I will calculate the gap in percentage points between the income of an Ontarian and the income of a Quebecois family at the same percentile of the income distribution, okay? And so in this picture, when the line goes down, that's good for Quebec, right? The gap got smaller. If it goes below zero, the gap is actually negative. Quebec incomes are higher than the corresponding incomes in Ontario. And again, the correspondence is where you are in the ranking of the income distribution. So you can see in 1998, adjusting for price differences, you were better off. Almost everyone was better off in Ontario. If they could magically move themselves to Ontario and be the same place in the income distribution, they would have been better off. That's no longer universally true, right? Incomes have risen across the board in Quebec. As a result, incomes are now higher for low-income families in Quebec. Lower inequality in Quebec benefits those families in this sense. And by 2018, you can see that the bottom 43% of families earn more on a real basis in Quebec than their counterparts in Ontario. That's the benefit of inequality, even though average incomes are lower here. Okay, why? I think I'm out of time, even though
You have time.
Pierre Carl is too polite to tell me when I have to stop, but I'm going to stop soon. Why these differences and why are they changing over time? We're engaged in this analysis. I'll just point out some important demographic factors that explain that difference. The first is, and so in this picture, for each part of the income distribution, I'm just going to report the average value of certain important features of the population of Quebec versus Ontario. And here, of course, the blue line is the average for Quebec. The red line is the average for Ontario, right? So what do we learn, first of all, from this picture? You have more prime age workers than Quebec does, than Ontario does right now. Through most of the income distribution, the proportion who are between ages of 30 and 65, and therefore in their prime earning years, is higher. And that's helping the income, that's helping incomes in Quebec. Maybe less than you would think, because the people over 65 are doing very well in Canada, right? Their incomes are high, but they're not working. They're receiving income from other sources. But so Quebecers now are younger in that sense, and that's helping their incomes. The second thing is education. Well, there are still more Quebecers who don't complete high school than there are Ontarians. It's much smaller difference than it was earlier, than it was 20 years ago, but that gap is still there. And that, of course, affects mainly incomes in the bottom of the income distribution, pushes them down in Quebec. Third, two-earner families. There are more two-earner families throughout the income distribution in Quebec, but particularly below the 80th percentile. Now, we are not doing an analysis that would allow us to say why that's true, but we do suspect that childcare policies are part of that difference, and that difference is getting larger over time. And so more two-earner families, that's good for incomes in Quebec. And then finally, immigration. There are fewer immigrants in Quebec, and that's good for incomes in Quebec. And as all these variables, of course, are changing over time, that's going to have an impact on this distribution and on this gap between Ontario and Quebec. And so this is only suggestive of what we think is going on. And it doesn't explain all the difference. Even controlling for all the factors that I've talked about, there is still a difference in incomes between Quebec and Ontario. It's interesting to speculate about what other factors that we cannot measure explain why Quebecers earn less than corresponding Ontarians in the top half of the distribution. Maybe we can talk about it later. But I'm going to conclude just by giving you a bottom line from this, right? In terms of the objective of closing the gap, the question is, what's the value to society in Quebec of the fact that, yes, incomes are lower, but they're more equally distributed? I can boil this down to one number here using the framework I've set up for you. And that's the one number is what we call, economists call, the equally distributed equivalent income. That's a specific dollar income level that if everyone in society, Quebec society or Ontario society, everyone received the same income, that would be just as good for us as the actual distribution that we have where some are richer and some are poor, okay? So my estimates tell you what is the cost of inequality in Canada. These data tell me how much inequality there is in Quebec versus Ontario. To compare those distributions, I will convert each province's distribution into one number, the equally distributed equivalent income. And let's see how Quebec's doing on this new adjusted target. And so there's just a reminder what those numbers are. 34% at the top, $1.40 at the bottom, and so on. So on the x-axis down here, you see the average incomes. So this is similar to pictures that you've seen before and that some in this room, I think, have created for government to help the government understand the choices. So as we move left in this picture, average incomes are rising in Quebec relative to Ontario. And you can see those effects have been very strong. Now, our data stopped in 2018 because my RA stopped in 2018. I think that's convenient today. I'm not here to judge the Legault government, right? I'm just talking about these trends. On the y-axis is the gap in EDEI, yeah? This new inequality adjusted measure of the difference between Quebec and Ontario. And you can see that that gap is falling even faster than the gap in average incomes because of the inequality benefits of what Quebec society is doing. And indeed, that gap, it's not gone. It's still $2,000 after adjusting for inequality. But that gap is very small compared to the average household income gap, which I measure, after adjusting for price differences, I measure now to be around $7,000. So, I mean, that's the bottom line. We should care about inequality. We should care about productivity too. And these kind of measures, this way of thinking, allows us to do both at the same time and to judge good policies from bad policies, and to know how much we're willing to pay to reduce inequalities or to increase incomes in a way which is unequal, and so on. And with that, I will conclude just by saying, now what should I say? So this is a method which I think has widespread use. It's important to understand what we're doing now in Canada and what it says about who we are and how much we care. And according to our estimates, the estimated social values are quite redistributive. We place a value of 30 to 40% on people at the top, 140% on the poorest among us. Is that a lot, though? Is it really a lot? People who are in the top 1% of the distribution have 10 times the income of the average in Canada. We are putting a 30% value on their incomes, but they have 10 times as much. So now you can use your own ethical judgments. Is that enough redistribution, or do we want more? But I'm not here to tell you what your ethical judgments should be. I'll just tell you how to use them. And using these estimated social weights, we can identify policies that redistribute any other spending program that redistributes just as well as the income tax system does. If it redistributes just as well as the income tax system, we should do it. If it doesn't redistribute as well as the income tax system does, for example, a policy that cut carbon prices now in Canada, we shouldn't do it. We have better ways to achieve our objectives. And that's the bottom line of this approach, and I will stop there. Thank you very much.